Okay, welcome everybody to Back to the Future of Work, our webinar. We've got a great session planned for you today with an absolutely stellar lineup. And so I hope you'll enjoy this engaging session. First up, we've got Fadia Smart, who's a partner at Spencer West in the Employment Law Department. And we also have Olivia Dobby, who's a barrister with Cloisters Chambers. They'll be discussing employment law issues. Next, we have Pavel Adrian, who's head of EMEA Research at Indeed, with some very interesting data for us. Then Sarangi Shah, a senior client manager at Vested, is going to take us through considerations about benefits. And then I'm going to talk to you about immigration. I'm an immigration and global mobility partner at Spencer West. Thank you so much for joining us today. So a few housekeeping points. First of all, if you'd like to see the speakers as well as the slides, then you can go into view options and select side-by-side mode. We'd like you today to put all of your questions into the Q&A box. You can like someone else's questions if it's one that you want, if it's one that you'd like to see answered as well. Please do not put your questions in chat. Sorry, speakers, I think I told you that the other way around, but all the questions will be in the Q&A box. We are going to have some polls for you today, and we'd love for you to answer them to facilitate the discussion. In some sections, we might take questions as we go. If you could just follow the lead of the presenters on that. Otherwise, we do hope to get to your questions perhaps at the end of each section or at the very end. But please do put your questions in the Q&A. We will get to them at some point. We just have loads of great content to get through today. And so we want to make sure that we prioritize that. So without further ado, I'll pass to Fadia and Olivia.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Now I have control of the slides. I'm Fadia Smart. I'm a partner at Spencer West, and it's my pleasure to give this presentation alongside a wonderful lawyer and now employment judge, Olivia Dobby from Cloisters. And we're going to try and canter through at some speed quite a lot of slides, simply because we have lots of information that we want to share with you today. So everyone's talking about the health and safety implications about returning to work amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And the government has produced a lot of guidance in the last few months, but it's important to bear in mind that we already have quite a detailed existing legislative framework, and it encompasses not only statutory duties, that's legislation set by Parliament, and a lot of that flows from the Health and the Safety at Work Act 1974, but we also have we have a hybrid system in this country. We've got a lot of judge-made law, which is known as common law. From the statutory provisions, employers have a duty to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all of their employees. And there are wider obligations not to just look at employees, but workers also, and in some circumstances, the self-employed. But that is the kind of principal legislation we have in that. And then with regard to common law, through all the centuries of arbitrating disputes in this area, there is a body of law that says employers have to take reasonable care for the safety of those people in its operation that might reasonably be affected. Sorry, I'm going a bit too fast. But the next slide is looking at some of the legislation that we have in place. Sorry, just bear with me. You should be looking at slide 6. But my mouse seems to have frozen, which is looking at the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. And in practice, and the government guidance deals with this anyway, so we can rest on this slide, you look at the Health and Safety at Work Act and it sets out some principal requirements, namely that an employer must assess and review work-related risks And essentially, the COVID-19 rules and legislation in place all build upon that. I might need some assistance, Samar, because for whatever reason my slides are frozen. But the second obligation is that an employer must make and give effect to the appropriate arrangements. So it's not enough simply to have done a risk assessment and leave it to gather moss. They then also have to become a living document, which an employer looks at in detail to ensure that it remains effective and suitable for purpose. And that includes looking at whether you need preventative and protective measures to be put in place. And what's really important is to have one person who is responsible for ensuring that those measures remain suitable. And also ensuring that you notify all of your staff what the legal requirements are upon them so that they can comply with it. Now, I'm going to hand over to Olivia. I think Samar may still control the next slide until I request control, but she's going to be looking at the government guidance specifically related to COVID-19.
Thank you, Fadia. Yes, as Fadia has stated, there is a general obligation that applies to all employers, whether there's a global pandemic or not, to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that there's a safe system of work and that it's implemented. But we now have some specific guidance from the government that was implemented and published in response to the specific risks posed by COVID. It's important to bear in mind, however, that these guides do not replace and do not amount to the law on what is required of employers to ensure health and safety at work. And that framework of law will still underlie and apply obligations on employers. In other words, merely by abiding by all of the steps in the guidance will not necessarily discharge an employer's obligations to their workforce. However, if an employer can demonstrate that they have taken all of the steps advised or mandated by the guidance, then that would be very good evidence in a case to suggest that they have taken the reasonably practicable steps. If we could move to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. So here we have the government guidance, the 5 steps, and this isn't specific to any workplace. These are 5 steps which are advised to be applied across any workplace. The first of which is carrying out a COVID-19 risk assessment in line with the HSE guidance. And when you look at the 5 steps more closely by following the link at the bottom, you'll see that you have to do this before the workplace reopens, and also that this is obligatory, it's not optional. It's also advised that each employer consults with trade unions or employee representatives in carrying out the risk assessment, because there might be specific risks that the management are not aware of if they don't work on the floor with the employees, so to speak. The next one is to develop cleaning, hand washing and hygiene procedures, but also to implement and enforce those. There are 6 requirements set out in the 5 steps. Number 3 is to help people work from home where possible. And this is actually a common feature across the government guidance about returning to work. Also in the sector-specific guidance, it says that where people can continue to work from home, they should do so. The next one is with respect to social distancing. And so despite the fact that we've had a relaxation of the social distancing from a strict 2 meters to this 1 meter plus, which no one quite fully understands, we've got maintaining 2 meters where possible under the 5 steps guidance. The sorts of measures that can be taken in order to try and achieve this is to put up signs reminding people of the 2 meter rule, and to mark the floors with paint or tape or something of that nature so people remember what a 2 meter distance looks like. And there are other recommended steps in the guidance that you can look at. And then finally, where people can't be kept 2 meters apart, to take other steps to try and manage the risk of transmission of COVID. Some examples given are to consider, first of all, whether the activity carried on by the particular employee is truly necessary to the business, or whether the business could continue to function without that activity or with the employee working from home. If they have to return to the workplace, consider physical screens or barriers to separate people that might help to reduce the transmission of the risk, and other measures such as staggering arrival and departure times. You can have a look at some of the suggested measures. Some of them I think are a bit strange, such as working back to back or side to side instead of face to face. Interestingly, I don't see any mention of masks, but that's something which an employer might want to do also. Moving on to the next slide then, please.
Impressed? Yep.
Now, we've also got sector-specific guides, and in May, 8 of these were published, and they are listed there. In late June, after we had compiled these slides, 4 further guides were published on new sectors, those which were reopening more recently. So that includes hotels and other accommodation, close contact services, which means hairdressers, that sort of thing, heritage locations, and the visitor economy. So we've now got 12 sector-specific guides. And then there's separate guidance also for education and childcare settings and public transport operators. Each of these guides are on average about 40 pages each. And whilst there's a lot of common material in them, I don't see any point in me going through them now. You can consider which might be relevant to you, your clients, your workplace, and have a look at those in your own time. But at least you can find them at that link. 2 common themes I would like to pull out, however, are that all of them require there to be a risk assessment prior to reopening activities. And also they all suggest that if workers can remain at home whilst activities are carried out, that should be the preferred method. So there are 2 underlying themes there. We can move to the next slide, please. And I think we've got a question popping up here.
Let's see if I can do that. Vidya, can you raise the question under polls?
Sorry.
That's all right. If we can't pop it up, I can simply cover it orally.
It's fine. I'll take control. Vidya, if you can relinquish, I'll run the slides and the polls for everyone. I think that's easiest. Okay. So the first poll question.
So it's not a poll, it's just the question.
Is about timing the return to the office. So did you want to still do that one?
Yeah, I think we might as well, actually, Olivia.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that we can have a look at the end so that everyone gets an idea about the numbers of people who might be returning to the workplace. I'll wait a few moments for people to vote on that, and then if we could have our second question, that would be great, Samar.
Okay. I think the polls are in. So the question was, when are you planning return of your staff to the office or on site? And 14% of attendees, staff has already returned to the office. 40% will return within the next 1 to 2 months, and 11% will return at the end of the year. For 34%, there's no plan in place yet, so that's interesting. Okay, thank you very much. I'll raise the next poll.
Thank you.
I see we have had a question, and we can probably deal with that at the end about whether masks should be provided in the workplace. So we'll definitely pick up on that. Thank you for the question.
Okay, let me go to the next one. Sorry about that. Just going to end this polling. Go to the next one. Here we go. Do you want to read it out?
I can't currently see it, Samar.
Do workers, so this is about the right to refuse. Do workers have the right to refuse to attend work due to fear of contracting the coronavirus? Yes or no? I'm going to launch that poll. Do workers have the right to refuse to attend work due to fear of contracting the coronavirus? It's about half and half.
Okay, well, that's good because it's a little bit of a trick question. So it's a little bit unfair of us to ask that. The very sort of specific, accurate answer is that no, workers don't. Domestic law only gives a right not to be subjected to a detriment or dismissal for refusing to return to work to employees. And there's a distinction in law between who is a worker and who is an employee. I could give a seminar on that topic alone. But moving on to the protections themselves, because these are very important. It's important to state that there's no absolute right to refuse to return to work. And if I could ask Fadia to click through to the next slide for me, or Samar. I'm going to focus in on the wording of section 100 and section 44 of the Employment Rights Act.
Okay.
So slide 10.
Yep. Just a minute. Is that right?
So under these sections of the Employment Rights Act, section 44 covers detriment, section 100 covers dismissal. Employees have the right not to be subjected to detriment or dismissed on the ground that, in circumstances of danger which the employee reasonably believed to be serious and imminent, they refused to return to work. So we can see that the employee has a cause of action if they reasonably believe that there are serious and imminent risks that they face if they return to work. However, we have to think about where that sits in context in circumstances where an employer has done all that they can think of to make the workplace safe. So where we've got an employer that has followed all of the guidance that's relevant to their workplace and taken all steps they can consider, is it still reasonable, would it still be reasonable for an employee to consider that they are facing a serious and imminent risk in returning to work? Well, we can see there's an obvious tension here. Employers have the right to expect their staff to follow reasonable management instructions, and employees are under contractual obligations to turn up and actually carry out their work. But then we've got this statutory protection for the employee, where if they think it's a risk to their health, that they are protected from any detriment in being required to do so.
I see we have a number of questions coming through on the chat. I'm looking at them, and we will try and get through all of them at the end.
Thanks, Fadia. I think what we need to think about is whether someone bringing a claim in circumstances where the employer has taken all reasonable steps, a judge in a tribunal would have to consider whether that employee's belief in serious and imminent risk is still reasonable. The sort of factors that will be relevant to that will include matters such as the extent to which the employer has assessed the risks, so how thorough the risk assessment is. How many measures have been taken to carry out and address the risks in the risk assessment, and the extent to which the employer has abided by government guidance will also be relevant. But also the specific vulnerability of the employee in question is something which will need to be borne in mind, because of course someone who is more predisposed to contracting COVID or to suffering more severely from it if they catch it could well consider the risk to them to be serious and imminent, whereas someone who doesn't have those risk factors, it might be said that a belief that the risk is serious and imminent in that case would not be reasonable. Now, Fadia is going to be addressing some of the specific risk factors that fall under the blanket of discrimination, because there are various matters that can make someone more predisposed to contracting COVID and suffering it more severely, that are also protected characteristics in discrimination law. But overall, what is an employer to do then in this sort of scenario? Well, we think the best answer is to carry out your risk assessment thoroughly, implement any matters arising from it, set up and implement all the protections which you can arising from the guidance, so follow the steps, but most importantly, to consult, negotiate and agree what steps need to be taken. This could be with employee representatives where you have a representative body, it could be with trade unions in a unionised environment, or it could be directly with the employees if you have a small workplace, but of course you can elect employee representatives. So in that scenario where you have employees engaging with and participating in consultation about what they feel would make their workplace safe, and they agree to it, it'll be much harder for them later to say that they reasonably believe that work wasn't safe. It doesn't give you immunity from suit, but it will assist. And then finally, back to slide 9 very briefly, if I may. So I've addressed the right to refuse to return to work, but there are also other sorts of claims that might be relevant, and these are the final 2 points, and these are rights that are available to workers as well as to employees. So these are your whistleblowing protections, and whistleblowing protects those against being subjected to detriments, but also from being unfairly dismissed. So if someone alleges to the employer some aspect of the workplace which they say gives rise to a health and safety risk, and they are subsequently dismissed or subjected to a detriment as a result of it, then they will have the protection of whistleblowing legislation, provided that they meet the other criteria, such as their whistleblowing being in the public interest. So those are the possible claims that an employer could face if they show a rather insensitive approach to requiring their workers to return to work. And I think Fadea is now going to take us through some of the discrimination pitfalls that an employer could find himself in.
Great. And just on also what Olivia was talking about, I read a recent Guardian article that said 170 care workers had called into what's known as the Compassionate in Care helpline about a lack of PPE, etc., and appropriate safety standards being upheld in their workplaces. So I do suspect that in addition to the discrimination claims I'm going to discuss in a moment, we will see a rise of whistleblowing claims. And it's also worth noting that up until now, claims brought for unfair dismissal on the basis of health and safety have been rather slim pickings. And I see that there's going to be a growth of claims in that area. But looking at these potential discrimination issues, now, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has only a few days ago published guidance on this, because it can see that the risk of discrimination claims due to the protected characteristics that people have in light of COVID. So cantering through this, pregnancy and maternity. Now, there is no clinical indication that pregnancy predisposes somebody to contracting COVID-19 or increases the risk of mortality. However, due to obviously the important time in a woman's life, pregnancy, and any risk to the unborn child, the government guidance has been that women who are pregnant should, work from home, etc. Now, an employer who insists that everybody has to be back at the office is clearly going to be at risk of claims being brought by pregnant employees, or those who've just had a child and may still be breastfeeding and are very worried about contracting the virus while caring for a new child. Also, and I think yesterday, the BBC and Sky News had mothers working from home and their children entering the TV screen and playing in the background. The statistics show that the brunt of childcare responsibilities has fallen on women. And again, if an employer is saying, now everybody back to work, a lot of schools and nurseries are still not open, that means it's going to put difficulty on more women perhaps than men, and that gives rise to the potential for indirect sex discrimination. And I'm yo-yoing on my slides, but there's an interesting argument that men could have claims to say, well, I shouldn't be required to return to work because men are showing so far to be more susceptible to contracting the virus and also dying from it. Now, with all of this, where you're looking at indirect discrimination, i.e. that there's a provision, criterion, or practice that on the face of it looks fair and reasonable to everyone, that has a disproportionately negative impact on those sharing that protected characteristic to others, it means that an employer has to look at the situation objectively and say, is this a proportionate way of meeting a legitimate aim? And with all of these are the factors employers are going to consider. With age, given that the over 70 are a high risk group, again, when an employer receives a request from a member of staff who doesn't want to return, they're going to have to take that into account. With disability, there are some medical conditions that increase the risk of contracting COVID-19. So if someone's clinically vulnerable, employees need to consider whether shielding is appropriate, furloughing them, home working, etc. But there's also what I see being the groundswell of mental health issues caused by COVID-19. People not getting to say goodbye to loved ones, people suffering unexpected deaths, etc. I think there are going to be higher rates of depression, anxiety, OCD that employers will have to take into account when looking at requests, because the disability discrimination rules do not only cover physical impairments, but also mental. And then on a race perspective, Black people appear 4 times more likely to contract and die from COVID-19. So if you had somebody, and I don't think race alone will be a good enough reason to say, I can't return to work. But we have to consider intersectionality. What if you have a Black 65-year-old with respiratory problems? Do you need to take that into account? And the answer is yes. And all of this will come into light as part of your risk assessment. Next slide, please, Samuel. So we've cantered through it at speed at the disability and all the other discrimination angles, but we will look at some of the questions that are dealing with that. Now I want to consider quickly home working. The fact is, on the 23rd of March, when everybody was required to work from home, we had the lockdown. Everybody who'd previously worked in jobs that said, no, this role can't be done from home, suddenly having to do it unless they were furloughed. But that means that a lot of the health and safety rules have not been complied with, because the legislative framework I mentioned many slides ago still applies to home workers. And employers therefore need to consider stress, equipment, electricity, having a first aid log for people working from home, accidents. And so at some point now, as home working becomes the new normal, employers will need to do risk assessments for all their staff to make sure that their homes are fit for purpose. I mean, there's a whole other talk we could talk about the other legal ramifications of home working, insurance, etc. But from a health and safety perspective, making sure that desks are ergonomically suited to your staff, etc., they are now going to come to the forefront. And although not health and safety related, it'd be remiss of us not to mention data protection, because the GDPR comes with quite significant fines, and employers need to ensure that staff are able to keep the data that is likely to fall under the GDPR safe and secure, and have the necessary confidentiality provisions in place to ensure that, you know, if you have somebody working with sensitive personal data, for instance, their family members are not looking at it on their computer screens. Olivia, did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, just on a practical point, if you've got lots of employees working from home that might have sensitive information whilst they're at home, you might want to consider the risk of GDPR breaches where people might be entering their home. They could have a cleaner, they might have housemates, a nanny, or you know, construction work going on, something like that. And in that sort of scenario, what you can do is ask your employees to require anyone who's going to be in their household who might oversee some sensitive information to sign a confidentiality agreement, so that if they hear any conversation or see any documents which they ought not to see, that they will not disclose those further. That's one practical measure to try and minimise the risk of breaching GDPR. We're
running out of time for the employment law section. So if you want to finish up and maybe take a question or two, Fadia, that would be great.
I think we are finished. I'm just
great.
going to look at some of the questions. We can take them one at a time. I'm perhaps being unfair to Olivia and picking some of the easier ones, but I see that we've got questions about, Mary Edwards, thanks for your questions about masks and what our advice is. To be at speed, an employer has to do the risk assessment, and as part of that risk assessment, they have to consider what appropriate equipment is required, and what measures need to be taken in order to secure and protect health and safety. So depending on the nature of your role, masks may be required. If you're in a client-facing role, you could see the need for PPE is going to be far greater than if you work in an office environment and they're able to do the 2-meter distancing, have screens up, etc. So I think the advice would be, if you have concerns, the health and safety laws also say that employers should consult with staff. So I would recommend that you raise the question with your employer to say, have you considered masks? And if you're not providing them, why not? Because that way you are highlighting to them a potential issue. And if they have good reasons for saying, yes, we considered it and we're not providing it, then that may allay your concerns. I don't know if you can see the questions, Olivia. Or do you want me to read?
I made notes on a couple of them as they popped up. I just want to address the one about pregnancy. So can you force a pregnant worker who's currently home working to come back to the workplace if you've taken all steps that you consider reasonably practicable to render it safe? I think there's a real risk area here. Firstly, because as things stand, pregnant women are included on the clinically vulnerable list, not the very vulnerable list, but on the clinically vulnerable list, along with the over 70s, etc. And so I think that you already have a bit of a red flag there to be careful about. Also that whether there's a pandemic or not, there's a legal obligation on employers to conduct a individual risk assessment for new and expectant mothers if there's anything in the workplace that could place them in hazard. And of course, exposure to COVID clearly would be such a hazard. So they might have more onerous duties in order to ensure that a pregnant worker can be safe in the workplace. And in the normal run of things, if you conclude that a pregnant worker can't be safe in the workplace, then you are obliged to suspend them on full pay. So I think that compelling a reluctant pregnant worker to return to a workplace that could be said to pose risk is likely to put you in a situation where, well, first of all, they'll be very disgruntled and they might well bring claims. Those claims may well have a good foundation, depending on what steps you have or haven't taken. And do you really want to wait until a judge decides on it to work out who was wrong or right in that scenario? It could be a rather expensive way of finding out.
Okay, we're going to have to go on to the next section, but we will address the other questions at the very end of the presentation. So don't worry. I did notice a couple of people raising their hands. If you could just put all of your questions into the Q&A, that would be best, please. So without further ado, Pavel is going to speak to us about the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I am an economist at the job site Indeed, and my section of the presentation will talk about the broader picture in the labor market, what COVID-19 means for the labor market and for hiring, and how remote working opportunities have been changing over the last few months. And I hope that kind of background is useful for those employers who are considering return to work issues and who are hiring or who are considering restarting hiring in the upcoming months. So the overall backdrop to what I'll be talking about is the picture of weak economic activity. We all know that the measures that were taken to fight the pandemic were necessary, but they also had a significant impact on economic activity. Many sectors were entirely shut down, and that led to a sharp contraction in output. The latest data shows that there's a vastly improved picture. So data from June shows that while economic activity is still contracting, with surveys of activity indexing below 50, which means a continued contraction, that is an improvement in terms of that contraction being much slower than what we originally saw in March and April. This big hit to economic activity has had big implications for the labor market, and we can see that on the next slide. Surveys of hiring intentions and vacancy data show a big drop in vacancies between March and now. Obviously, it's difficult for many employers to hire people in lockdown, but also the overall economic uncertainty means that a lot of businesses have just reduced or stopped hiring entirely. At the same time, we're seeing that the number of people who are claiming unemployment-related benefits has increased substantially. And while official unemployment is still low in the latest statistics, thanks to government support schemes like the coronavirus job retention scheme, there are concerns that unemployment will be rising over the coming months. And so that picture of falling vacancies and rising number of people out of work means that the ratio of unemployed per vacancy is rising very rapidly. What that means for job seekers is that it's those who are looking for a job are going to find it a lot harder to find one than just a few months ago. What it means for employers is that conversely, those employers who are hiring may see rising numbers of applicants, rising numbers of candidates. But I'll show you in a second that that's not a uniform picture across the market. The question on everyone's mind is how things will evolve and when the economy will recover, and what that means for the labor market and for recruitment. But the future is actually quite difficult to predict. A lot of people are making forecasts, but it's really hard to understand at this point what that recovery will actually look like in terms of pace and timing. There are a few reasons for that on the next slide. First of all, there is still a lot of uncertainty about the health aspects of the crisis. We don't know when we will be safe. As we've just been discussing, employers are struggling with providing a safe working environment, and a lot of employees are worried about their safety. But this also extends more broadly to the economy in terms of people potentially not being sure whether they're safe shopping, going out. And so that has an impact on consumption. Now, spending by consumers has been recovering at a pretty brisk pace over the last 2 months, which is a positive sign, but it still hasn't reached pre-pandemic levels. Secondly, there's also policy uncertainty. We still aren't sure what the government's recovery plan will look like. There will be some announcements coming up next week about that plan. For the time being, some of the support schemes for businesses and workers are set to start tapering over the summer and into early autumn. And we still don't know if the exit strategy will be successful or whether it risks causing another rebound in the infection rate. And then finally, there is behavioral uncertainty. So, how will businesses and consumers react to all this? For the time being, it looks like many businesses have paused investments, they have paused hiring, as they aren't certain about demand for their products and services. Consumer reaction will be key to driving the reaction of businesses and the spending by businesses. For the time being, those sources of uncertainty are reflected in economic forecasts. What you're seeing on the current slide is a recent forecast by the OECD for the world's largest economies, the world's 7 largest economies, including the UK. And they have structured their forecast as 2 possible scenarios. The blue bars show a single hit scenario in terms of the pandemic, so a single peak of infections, which then starts to reduce. But they also created another scenario of a double hit, which would mean a pickup in infections, and so a kind of inverted W shape in terms of how the pandemic evolves. And in both scenarios, they're expecting economic output in 2020 to be lower in all these economies for the full year than what it was in 2019, which means that they don't expect any recovery in the second half of the year to fully make up for the hit to economic activity that we're experiencing in the first half of the year. So before I tell you what we see in Indeed's data on the labor market, I just wanted to run a quick poll, if we could get that up and running.
Sure, one sec.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, so the question I wanted to ask everybody on the call was, what are your expectations in terms of your business, and when does your business plan to restart hiring? If you're hiring now, please answer the second quarter of 2020. Otherwise, please tell us about your expectations in terms of when you think you would restart hiring, whether it's in the third or fourth quarter of this year, the first quarter of next year, or the second quarter of 2021, or even later. So let's just give everyone a few minutes to vote.
That's very interesting. that people are more likely to be hiring now than in the third quarter this year.
Okay, is it possible to see the results?
Yes, let's see it.
Okay, so it looks like about a fifth are already hiring or have already started hiring in the second quarter. And the answers are actually quite split across these different time periods, with the fourth quarter of this year being the most common option. But we're also getting a lot of answers about the third quarter of this year, so the current quarter, the first quarter of next year, or even beyond that. This is very similar to the answers I have recently received in other business forums. And I suspect that this reflects to a certain extent differences across sectors of the economy. Some sectors, as I'll show you in a second, have been very actively hiring even throughout the pandemic. Of course, some kinds of businesses remained open and urgently needing staff, like food retail, for instance, transportation, social care, healthcare. But other sectors still haven't reopened, and then others are worried about the uncertainty, the economic uncertainty, and therefore are still pressing the pause button on hiring. So what do we see in Indeed's data? As I mentioned at the beginning, Indeed is a global job site. And for those of you who don't know Indeed, we are the largest job site in the UK in terms of visits. In May, we had over 30 million visits to indeed.co.uk. We, on the job side, we aim to cover the online job market as fully as possible. So right now, if you go on Indeed, you see just over 300,000 vacancies across the UK. That's substantially down from about 800,000 earlier in the year. But that tracks quite well the official statistics on vacancies while giving us a more real-time view of the labor market. So this huge amount of data that we have both on jobs and on job seekers really gives us a front row view into what's going on in recruitment and in the labor market. And that's very useful as we try to measure the effects of the pandemic because official statistics are lagging the real world by weeks or even months. So what do we see in the data? Well, first of all, on the next slide, I wanted to show you the overall trend in job postings on Indeed, which gives us a sense of how employers have reacted to the pandemic. And what we see is that job postings are down 60% relative to the pre-pandemic period in February, which is an unprecedented decline, and one that means that people who are looking for jobs, either because they've lost their job or they've seen their hours reduced, or they're entering the labor market after graduating from university or leaving school, have fewer opportunities available than they would have otherwise at the same time last year. What it also means for employers who are still hiring is that they're facing less competition from other employers for those candidates, depending on the sector they're in. What we're seeing is that food and hospitality jobs have been hit hardest, which is perhaps unsurprising given that those sectors were almost entirely shut down. So if they couldn't operate their businesses, it's unlikely that they would have been hiring. On the other end of the spectrum, health and social care related jobs are those that have held up best. Again, those types of services are always in demand in economic crisis, but demand for those has held up especially well, given that the current crisis is a health crisis as well. Tech-related jobs are down more or less in line with the economy average, as are retail-related jobs. And I know we have a lot of people interested in legal issues on this call. Jobs in legal occupations were down 72% relative to last year's trend. So what this means again for employers is that if you are in a sector that has suffered a big fall in vacancies, but you are hiring, then you're facing a lot less competition. On the other hand, for job seekers and new entrants to the labor market, people who would have typically aspired to work in some of those sectors that have been heavily affected are not seeing as many opportunities as they would have otherwise. So what does this really mean in terms of the competitiveness of the labor market? Well, we're seeing some types of jobs, still trying to be filled by employers. So there's still a lot of demand for people for certain kinds of roles. But job seekers, are also shifting in terms of their interests and their needs. So for instance, we're seeing that people from the food and hospitality sectors are representing a greater share of the job seeker pool today, and those people are looking for new opportunities in some of these other sectors that are hiring, especially the lower paid sectors. So what you see on the left-hand side of this table are the jobs that are currently seeing the highest number of candidates per job posting. That's data from June. And the top 10 jobs include sort of customer-facing roles primarily, so both retail-related roles like sales assistant or retail sales associate, but also other customer service and supply chain roles like client advisor or order picker or receptionist. We're also seeing a few sort of administrative roles, but again, those tend to be the more customer-facing roles in businesses that still need staff to service customers during this downturn. And what we're seeing is that job seekers are really flocking to those roles, and that's because those roles tend to have fairly low barriers to entry in terms of qualifications or training. So it's relatively easy for people from sectors like hospitality to switch to these kinds of jobs when hospitality jobs aren't as widely available. But this doesn't really mean that all employers are going to find it easier to hire people in this environment. And you see that very well on the right-hand side, where you see the jobs that have the fewest candidates per job posting, even in this environment where we're seeing potentially more and more people needing jobs right away. In areas like healthcare, and in other areas that are highly paid and that require a lot of qualifications like law, education, or finance, we're still seeing very low numbers of candidates relative to demand from employers. And that isn't really changing compared to the time before the pandemic. So we're seeing this kind of divergence where certain employers are being overwhelmed with applications relative to the number of jobs they have, while others will still probably be struggling to hire people with the right skills despite the crisis. Before I conclude, I just wanted to talk about one other trend that we're seeing in the market, which is related to remote work. And again, I think that's quite relevant to thinking about reopening offices, workplaces, and asking people to return to work. Since March, we've seen a sizable increase in the share of job searches on Indeed that use keywords related specifically to remote work. So these are searches for keywords like working from home, working remotely. And we've seen that almost quadruple in terms of its share of all job searches on Indeed. So there's a lot of interest from job seekers in remote work, even today, even as some sectors of the economy are reopening. And we've also seen employers react to that trend by mentioning remote work opportunities more explicitly in job descriptions. And you see that on this table, where on the left-hand side, you see the types of occupations that are most likely to advertise remote work. And those include tech occupations and other occupations related to media and communications, mathematical occupations, civil engineering. Those are occupations where employers are the most explicit about remote working opportunities. And they also tend to be the occupations where remote work was already most prevalent even before the crisis. On the other hand, there are still lots of jobs that simply cannot be done remotely, and you see those on the right-hand side. Medical occupations, food and hospitality, those are jobs that require physical contact with customers or patients, and barring any big technological revolution, those jobs will not be advertising remote work to the same extent as some of those other roles you see on the left-hand side. So again, a big divergence in terms of remote work being growing in popularity in areas that already enabled remote work, and other occupations really being left behind in terms of possibilities of working from home. And that again means that challenges related to returning to work are likely to be different, say at a tech firm, compared to other types of businesses.
Great. We're running very short on time. Pavel, did you have anything else to say? I think we'll take questions on your section at the end, if that's okay.
That's fine. I haven't had a chance to look at the Q&A tab yet, so I'll look at it now and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Sarangi, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarangi, a employee benefits consultant at Vested. And today I want to talk about how you can adapt your benefits for the future world of work. But just before we start, I just want to take a quick poll, and I just want to understand what's kind of important for your organisation, what will be the kind of key focus in the next couple of months. So Samara, if we can get the poll question up. Yeah. So will it be focusing on maintaining or reducing employer costs? Are you looking at reshaping your employee benefits? Perhaps the most important thing is communicating those benefits to employees, or it might be improving processes and reducing admin. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to answer. So that's quite interesting. So it does appear to be maintaining or reducing employer costs is the main focus. We've got about a quarter for the next two. So reshaping employee benefits and communicating those to employees, and there is also some interest in improving processes and reducing admin. So the first part I was actually going to talk about is the financial aspects. So for the past 4 months, we've seen most employers trying to keep a steady ship through a period of significant turmoil. As we're now entering a different phase where businesses need to consider the slightly longer term plans for reward and what their objectives and priorities are, this is the perfect opportunity to review, reflect and plan. So you will need to consider the financial aspects about whether you can still afford to maintain the benefits as they currently are and what your current expenditure is. Reward and benefit budgets have come under tighter scrutiny during this current crisis as organisations look to cut costs wherever possible. So it's really important to understand what your current expenditure is and how effective and the return on investment that you have for your benefits will be crucial. You might also find there are opportunities to make cost savings by reviewing your benefits, maybe rationalising or tweaking them as well. You might need to actually spend more on existing or new benefits, and that might be particularly relevant for wellbeing benefits. So anything that improves the employee's physical, mental or financial well-being. So as Fidia mentioned earlier, employers need to act on the toll of coronavirus on mental health for their workers with some urgency. Studies have shown that during lockdown, anxiety and depression have worsened. And given that there's a strong link between worker happiness and productivity, employers may want to look at offering some sort of mental well-being provision. There's a number of different ways that could include access to bereavement counselling, trauma counselling, employee assistance programs, online wellbeing workshops, even having budgets for self-help books or mental wellbeing apps. Of course, both mental and physical health can be improved by encouraging more active lifestyles. We've seen cycling has doubled during lockdown, and businesses have the power to make tax-free bicycles and e-bikes available to their staff through the Cycle to Work scheme. That might also be for accessories like lights and locks. And we also expect companies might want to make it easier for employees to travel to the workplace by offering secure indoor bike parking, which will make life easier for those that feel unsafe using public transport. You will need to re-engage employees on benefits, especially those that have been furloughed and are now returning back to work. You might also want to consider how you're communicating to them and changing that method over the long term. I'll talk about this more in the next slide, but undoubtedly some businesses will need to alter their benefit packages and approaches in future, especially if they undertake significant organisational changes. So that might be structural changes such as working patterns, reducing working hours, or closing certain sites, or unfortunately even redundancies. As Pavel mentioned, remote working will also feature as a more permanent fixture, we believe. So over the medium term, you'll need to consider if your current approach to remuneration and benefits is still relevant and competitive for these employees. And you might have also find that benefits administration has become more onerous because the HR and benefits team have been working remotely. So this is also a good opportunity to review how you're managing and administering these benefits. I recently spoke to some pension providers, and it was interesting to hear that they've actually updated some of their processes to make them more accessible in a digital format. So instead of having paper forms, they're using electronic forms and signatures. So this is a good opportunity over the medium term to look at your own internal processes and see how you can streamline them. And then over the longer term, you need to consider how the benefit packages fit in with your overall business strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. And really you should be allocating a budget for benefits expenditure and resources if you want to have a good return on your investment. And the links between different systems, so you might have a HR system, payroll system, benefit system. Thinking about how you can link these together will be crucial to managing your employee data. So on the next slide, just want to talk about engaging your workforce. Due to the COVID-19 crisis, a huge number of employees are working remotely, and employers have been taking steps to try and ensure they keep in touch and help staff to continue feeling engaged and part of the company. So you might have seen in your own companies or heard other companies have increased the usage of social media apps such as Slack. You might have been doing things like online classes, team activities, company-wide communications such as CEO videos, all just to help employees and colleagues stay in touch with each other. And it's really important that employee benefit communications aren't forgotten either. To engage your workforce, you really need to consider the benefits that you currently offer and whether they're really relevant. So even down to things like whether you continue to offer a free fruit basket in your office, that might not be relevant anymore. Or if you had gym memberships that were close to the office actually employees may prefer to have those nearer to their home if they're going to be working from home in future. So it's important to go through all the different benefits you offer and whether they're going to still reflect your workforce needs. And the big impact will be how you're communicating those benefits as well. So the traditional methods of using paper-based or posters in the canteen or even face-to-face presentations in the office may no longer be relevant. And we see digital forms of communication becoming really important. So on the next slide, I've just shown you what we think is going to be the game changer, benefit systems. And I've just got another poll question to kind of understand whether you're using benefit systems already in your organisation or not. So hopefully everyone's responded to that poll. So interesting to see that actually 2/3 of our audience today don't have a benefit system in place. And it might be something to consider over the kind of medium to long term, especially if there's a big change in your workforce. So for us, using benefits technology will allow employees to view their benefits information online, be it through a laptop, smartphone, or tablet. So just on the next slide, you might have seen during this period an increase in the number of emails that you receive. So having targeted and personalised emails sent from a benefit system where it's branded might actually help them to stand out and be read amongst all the various different emails that you receive. Having easy to view online reward statements and benefit information in one place might make it easier for employees instead of having to trawl through intranets trying to find the information that they want. We also think that using a benefit system will also help HR manage their administration better as well, and especially if they are also working from home. We found that benefits technology has become more affordable, so even for smaller employers, we see demand rising significantly over the next 3 years. So just to summarise, employers need to start planning what the coming months look like for their organisation, including the financial position and the impact that it will have on their benefits and reward structure. You should be reviewing the current benefits you offer to see if they're still relevant for your workforce, and especially how you communicate those. Employee engagement remains key, and therefore, if you're not communicating it, everything else, will be of no value. And we see benefits technology playing a key part here.
Great, thank you so much, Sarangi. I'm briefly going to talk about sponsoring skilled workers today, tomorrow, and remotely. But I see we have over 30 questions now in the Q&A, and I definitely want to get to those. Those who've joined me for webinars previously must know that it's breaking my heart slightly not to be able to address them as we go along. So I'm going to speed through this, and if you have any questions on this, please do enter them in the Q&A, and we hope to address them all. So I'm first going to talk to you a bit about sponsorship. So Pavel's very interesting data indicates that some employers are still going to need all available tools, need to employ all available tools to be able to attract the talent that they need, and particularly where they need skilled workers. And so a lot of employers are still going to need to sponsor non-EEA nationals to work in the UK. From the beginning of next year, after the end of the post-Brexit transition period, when the future immigration system is in place, that's going to be even more important. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I'll just go through the basics of sponsorship for you. So a sponsor license is required if an employer in the UK wants to employ non-EEA nationals who don't otherwise have the right to work. For example, as a family member of a British person, or if they're on an ancestry visa, there are other visas that allow for work. But if the talent you want doesn't have visa allowing work already, then you'll need to sponsor them. And this sponsor license allows you to assign certificates of sponsorship on an online system called the Sponsor Management System. These certificates are the work authorizations for these non-EEA nationals. And they use these certificates of sponsorship to support their visa applications. They're required to have them in order to be eligible to apply for sponsored skilled worker visas. And there are two main categories of sponsorship. There's Tier 2 General, that tends to be for new hires, and Tier 2 Intra-Company Transfer for employees that are currently working for linked companies overseas. So that's a very kind of broad view of sponsorship there. I just want to ask you all a question before proceeding, and that is, when you're applying for a sponsor license, what is the first thing you should do? So what is the first step when applying for a license to sponsor skilled non-EU nationals to work in the UK? Is it submitting the online form? Is it putting HR systems in place? Or is it gathering the required supporting documents? I'll just give you one more minute to answer. These are anonymous, your answers, so don't be shy. All right. I'm going to share these results with you. Now, most people said that the first thing you should do is to gather the required supporting documents. That is, an intuitive and sensible answer. Unfortunately, it's not the right answer. The first thing any employer should do when considering applying for a sponsor license is to put the HR systems in place that are required to support sponsor duties. If you go ahead and submit an online form as your first step, you are going to get into hot water very quickly, and I'll explain why in a minute. Thank you very much for answering. So I'll take you through the steps of applying for a sponsor license, because as I said, many more employers are going to need this in future, and perhaps some employers who are currently struggling to hire skilled workers are considering it now. So the first thing you need to do is put the HR systems in place to support your sponsor duties. And there are three main sets of duties. There are compliance duties, record keeping duties, and reporting duties. So compliance means only sponsoring people when you're doing so according to the Home Office requirements. And I'll talk a bit about those requirements in a minute. Record keeping, there's certain things you have to keep on file about each sponsored worker, and then reporting. So you'll have to report changes to their circumstances. So if their job title changes or their responsibilities change slightly, that's a matter of reporting. The other thing you have to do is to decide who will be the key personnel on the license. So every sponsor license needs to have an authorizing officer who's responsible for everything that happens, and a level 1 user who engages with the sponsor management system to actually assign the certificates of sponsorship, amongst other roles. So you have to decide who's going to fill those roles in your organization. Then you gather the supporting documents, and then once you have the supporting documents in place, you complete the application form. And you don't complete the application form until this stage, because in normal circumstances, the Home Office has to receive the hard copy supporting documents within 5 days of submission of the online application form. So you have very little time between submitting the form and getting the documents to the Home Office. So definitely look at the supporting documents first. Once you've submitted all of those, the Home Office might come to visit, and that's to check that you have the HR systems in place to support your sponsor duties. Because basically the way the whole sponsorship system works is the government is passing the buck to employers to be responsible for authorizing people to work in the UK, and that's a big responsibility. So the way they maintain control is forcing any employers who want a sponsor license to sign up to fulfill these duties, and then enforcing their fulfillment of those duties by visiting and checking that they have the HR systems that they need. So once you have your license in place, you want to be sponsoring migrants to work. Now, I'm going to run through some of the requirements, but I just want to stress this very much a case-by-case analysis, because the sponsorship system is actually extremely complex with lots of time limitations, exceptions, and requirements. And so you do want to look at each case, application on a case-by-case basis. If you try to do a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, there are going to be compliance breaches. So in terms of the role, at the moment, roles that are eligible for sponsorship are those that are at the skill level of Regulated Qualifications Framework, or RQF6, and that means graduate level roles. There are some exceptions to that. The role has to fulfill 2 salary thresholds. One relates to the subcategory of Tier 2. So that's Tier 2 General, Tier 2 Intercompany Transfer. And the other one relates to the specific role that the migrant is going to fulfill and their level of experience. The other thing about the role is that it has to be a genuine vacancy. And basically this means that if you weren't hiring this migrant to do the role, you would need to hire someone else to do it. And unfortunately, the guidance to caseworkers goes a bit further than the rule in this regard and says that genuine vacancy is one where the job description doesn't include lower skilled tasks, as well as some of the ones that match the skilled role that you're sponsoring for. That's just not realistic in today's labor market. You know, we all have to do scanning and copying every once in a while, don't we? So I don't think that's a realistic requirement. In terms of the visa holder, you have to make sure that their qualifications and experience match the advertising that you've undertaken, if advertising was required, and that they match the job description and the responsibilities they'll be taking on. If they're a Tier 2 intercompany transfer migrant, they usually will have to have 12 months service. There is an exception to that. If they're coming under Tier 2 General, they'll need to demonstrate their English language ability. They'll need to show they have adequate funds to maintain and accommodate themselves without access to public funds. I do encourage sponsors to undertake to maintain sponsored migrants for their first month of employment, which does away with which fulfills the maintenance requirement, and then you don't have to start looking at applicants' bank statements, for example. Depending on which country an applicant is coming from, they might first have to obtain a TB certificate. It's important to check that early on because it can take a while. So let's talk about the future of sponsorship. It's quite exciting. So in the future immigration system, the skill level that's required for roles for which you want to sponsor what will be non-UK nationals, to include EEA or European Economic Area nationals. The skill level that will be required is Regulated Qualifications Framework 3, and that means A levels or above. And technically this covers medium and highly skilled roles. So this is one reason why more UK employers are going to be engaging with the sponsorship system, and more employers might be interested in obtaining a sponsor license. You can apply now for a sponsor license that will be effective in the new immigration system. It's basically a transition to the new system that will take all existing sponsors with it into the future. The salary level is going to drop as well to $25,600, and lower salaries than this will also be possible depending on whether the job is in a shortage occupation or the individual has a PhD. So that's where the points assessment comes in the government's future points-based system. It's a very small part of the process. The government has also proposed to abolish the Tier 2 cap, which is the limit of 20,700 visas for certain types of Tier 2 migrants per year. And that's a welcome change because the process for requesting the certificates of sponsorship, this special kind of certificate of sponsorship, is onerous and time consuming. So another thing that's going to be relevant in the future for sponsored workers, as well as many, many other workers in the UK, is remote working, which a number of the other panelists have helpfully discussed. So at the moment, sponsors are not required to report a job location change where someone's home working because of coronavirus. That's a temporary COVID-19 policy that the Home Office has promulgated. But what's going to happen in the future? You know, it seems like remote working is here to stay. So the best practice is to document home working if it is going to continue past COVID-19. Once these COVID-19 temporary provisions terminate, we don't know when that might be yet. The Home Office hasn't announced. So how would you do that? Well, if the sponsored worker is really working from home for a significant part of the week, then perhaps their home should be listed as a job location on their certificate of sponsorship. It is possible, if that's the case, that the Home Office compliance officers could visit their homes because it's a listed job location. So that's an interesting question that's raised by the future of remote working for sponsored workers. It should also be documented in their employment contract or otherwise documented in their HR files. Existing sponsors who are attending this webinar will know that the Home Office just wants to see documentation of all the systems and agreements in place. Now, even if you don't have to report the job location change because of the coronavirus provisions, it's otherwise best to have documentation of the temporary change being due to the pandemic on file, even if you're not reporting it on the sponsor management system. The other thing for sponsors to consider in relation to remote working is how they're going to monitor their employees effectively. And that means both in terms of management and in terms of monitoring absences. So a sponsor undertakes to be responsible for the outputs, functions, and outcomes of a sponsored worker's job. And that basically means managing them, really. And so there will have to be monitoring systems in place, documented monitoring systems to show that a sponsor is continuing to do that while people are working remotely. I would also recommend having systems in place for managers to be in contact with the sponsored workers that they're managing. And it's best if this isn't just ad hoc, but there's some kind of process or regularity to it so that sponsors can demonstrate to compliance officers from the Home Office, should they visit, that they have a system in place, they know what the sponsored workers are doing, they're managing them appropriately. Similarly, absences become more difficult, or you have to manage them in a particular way if people are working remotely. So an electronic timesheeting system can be quite useful for that. It's unlikely that a system where you can just kind of tell when someone's on their laptop is sufficient, particularly if there's no record of that. So that is a whistle-stop tour of sponsorship today and in the future. And I just want to thank everybody for their attention. I know it was very, very long. We're now going to take questions. I'm also putting up here the panelists' contact details on this slide and on this slide. And whilst we take questions, panelists, if you want to unmute yourselves, we can start going through some of the questions. Those who have to go, perfectly understandable. Thank you for sticking with us this long. We really enjoyed the presentation. And so now we'll just take a few questions. Fadia and Olivia, do you want to?
I've got one topic I wouldn't mind responding on, if you don't mind me jumping in first, Fadia.
No, go for it.
It was a question about what damages the employer could be liable for with respect to the sorts of claims we talked about. And so just to clarify that, the claims that give rise to an unfair dismissal, the employee could claim not only loss of income for however long they're out of work, but also they might apply for a remedy of reinstatement or re-engagement. Reinstatement is being put back into their job if it still exists, and re-engagement is being re-engaged by the same employer in another job. And this is quite relevant with respect to what Powell has told us about the decline in vacancies, because tribunals tend to assess loss of income by reference to the reasonable attempts made by someone who's been dismissed to find a new job. And if they've been out of work for, say, 12 months, and yet they can demonstrate that they have been making regular applications, then they could end up getting 12 months, maybe even more, 18 months of damages under an automatic unfair dismissal claim. Whereas in normal times, their damages might be more limited because there would be data to show that there are lots of jobs available. And it's worth bearing in mind that damages for automatic unfair dismissal for health and safety and whistleblowing are uncapped, whereas ordinary unfair dismissal would be capped at a statutory cap or the employee's gross salary for the year, whichever is the lower. So it's actually very important at a time like this to consider the jobs market. And with respect to detriments claims, you can get what we call injury to feelings. So how the detriment you've been subjected to, how it affects you. It could cause you stress, it could cause anxiety, could even give you a personal injury for which you might be able to claim damages. So you could have, hopefully not, but in some cases people have psychiatric breakdowns, and those are matters for which you can claim damages also. Yes, it's worth bearing in mind the risks.
I'm going to try and cover some of the questions which are all about health and safety. One of them is saying that the employer had people working kind of a skeleton staff throughout, and there doesn't seem to have been any real steps taken from a health and safety perspective, and it all appears ad hoc. Now, you may potentially have grounds to say that they've failed to comply with their health and safety requirements. And that's the kind of thing that can be raised if you've in a large enough business by your health and safety representative or your union or your standing body of elected representatives, or it can be raised, individually with your managers. It's the kind of thing that you can also put into a grievance, which could subsequently lead to some of the claims Olivia was discussing earlier, such as, if you're an employee and you feel that you're in imminent danger and have reasonable belief of that, to bring a claim under Section 100D. But the thing is, travel is also something that the employer should be looking at as part of their risk assessment. And if your employer has just said to people, get to work and we'll do the 2-meter distancing, and hasn't actually taken into account that large numbers of people will have to take public transport, they could again fall foul not only of the existing legislative framework, but the explicit COVID-related provisions. So again, these are all things that I talked about, dialogue and consultation being key, that you should be raising with your employer, whether collectively or individually. And depending then on how they've dealt with that, that could give rise to your potentially raising a grievance and having certain types of claims. But the main thing is to ask them, have you considered it? If so, can you please show us your workings out and why you think this is appropriate? And it's also just worth reiterating that the government is saying it's still its position that where possible, people should be working from home. And so if an employer cannot satisfy itself that that the level of safety for staff is suitably met by them coming into the office, and it is possible for them to work from home, that should be the primary position.
Great. Should we have a look at some of the other questions? Very nice messages of thanks here.
Appreciated.
I can probably answer one of the questions on there about whether the benefits technology can run benefit reports, and that's definitely the case. So where you've been perhaps using forms previously to get selections on flexible benefits, collecting those and inputting those into Excel spreadsheets, sending those on to providers, the benefit system allows you to automate that process. So employees can go on, view their own accounts and make selections, and actually the system automates the benefit reports. So there is a scheduled reminder for HR every month to let them know their benefits reports are ready to download. And those can then easily be sent on to benefit providers and also payroll as well. So it's streamlining and automating that whole process, and also potentially minimizing any errors as well that you get by inputting things manually.
Okay, great. And I just want to remind everybody, we're trying to take as many of the questions now as we can, but I'm aware, we're running quite over now. So please do get in touch directly with panelists if you want to ask them your questions directly and we don't get to them now. I'll just see some more questions. Pavel, did you want to answer any of the questions?
I've tried to answer the questions on the chat. So
Okay,
if I
great.
missed anything, please feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to follow up offline.
Okay, I see a question about what the panel members might think about the impact of COVID on outsourcing generally. I don't know who might be best placed to answer that. Maybe you, Pavel? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have a lot of specific thoughts. I know that some people in the recruitment industry believe that outsourcing will rise during the crisis, but I don't have any specific insights on that.
I think in terms of immigration, I think people might be less interested in business visit type of visas, but the types of roles that are skilled enough to be outsourced, I think, would not actually be affected. I think for most roles, skilled roles, it will probably be a mix of remote working and in-person working. And so there is some need for the person to, or the team to still be in the country. So I'm not sure it will have a huge effect actually, but it's a very interesting issue to keep one's eye on. We're not taking hand raising, so please do stick your questions in the chat. I think we've handled most of them. We'll now go ahead and sign off, but if we have missed anybody's questions, please do get in touch. So again, you have Sarangi and Pavel's details there, and then mine, Fudia's, and Olivia's details there. Right, well, I'm only left to say thank you very much for joining us, everybody. I'm sorry about the technical glitches. I've never presented a webinar with so many panelists before, but I think the content was great. Thank you so much to my panelists. It's really fantastic input. And we hope to see you at another webinar soon. Keep in touch and stay safe. Bye, everybody.
Bye.